the decision-making powers have been captured by particular interests. Now, one thing that my dear true Finns, in which I and they differ, is this idea of the people. So in the critique of expertise and party politics, the idea of the people as a substance plays an enormous role. So in Brexit, the people must have control. In Trump elections, the people their voice must be heard. And this idea of the people is, of course, not just an aggregate of citizens. It's a substantive notion. It's a set of values, preferences, ideas about one's ethnic identity, ideas about history, politics, and so on. And what is quite crucial to that idea of people is that it captures everything. So it's a universal notion. Parties and democracy works through particulars coming together. A party, a social democratic party, a centre party, a labour party, etc., are all representatives of particular groups. Now, what true Finns and their colleagues around the world think is that they don't really just represent a particular faction. They represent the people in this substantive notion, which gives them the higher ground because you, others, are not part of that people, because you've been corrupted. You have defeated us in an unjust battle. So now it's our turn, and it's not just we as individuals, it is the people. The international in which you, the adversary, move is a fraud. It's nothing but a group of people who speak national languages, who've been trained in domestic societies, who come from particular places and are just as particular as anybody else. But they've invented this idea of the international and used that in order to perpetuate the victory that they have received. So this is my understanding of the nature of the critique, which, of course, cannot be just responded in the way Mark Zuckerberg suggests, to think of these people as having been left behind, as these people as having to bring them to the next level. The dilemma, as I understood it, and this may be completely incomprehensible to you, but it's kind of an apology to utopia mindset that produces these kinds of graphs. So there are two ways, I think, in which the defenders of the international system, whether you want to call them liberals or not, can defend it. Either defend it by highlighting the principled nature of the policies, taking up once again ideas such as peace, as self-determination, as global equality, whatever, but to remind ourselves that these valuable objectives are what we have been striving for. And that, I think, is what some of my colleagues have been suggesting in order to counter critique number one here on the left corner, namely the critique that these international and EU organs are just a hopeless bureaucracy. A hopeless bureaucracy captured by special interests to uphold the privileges of those who move within the flawed world that the international is. So in order to respond to that critique, the critique of bureaucracy, you want to lay out principled policymaking. You want to talk at a high philosophical, political level. Unfortunately, that doesn't help, because that then is just talk. That is immediately heard by those who have been defeated by yet another familiar move on the part of the victors to give us these words that we've been hearing for half of our lives. And of course then that issue of just talk can then be, I think, responded efficiently only by proposing institutional action, institutional alternatives. Let's have a better system of comitology in the European Union. Let's integrate the voice of the true Finns better in Brussels policymaking. Unfortunately, that then sounds like well, yet another bureaucratic set of proposals to deal with the critique. So, if one thinks of these as the alternatives, and these two types of critiques as what one hears now, then the way to respond, I think, seems rather difficult. Not impossible, of course, because nothing is as simple as these figures. So, I end with a couple of reflections. So, there are three kinds of responses that I've been reading from lawyers recently. The first one is more of the same, but better. So with a greater voice. So this is Mark Zuckerberg, but also the director of the Max Planck Institute on International and Public Law, Anne Peters, in a recent working paper that I just brought with me to Jerusalem and the other day and read on the plane. So what they suggest is that the principles are as good as they always were. They have just not been explained well enough. They have not, so we don't have a catechism that everybody would be reading. So you should do more work to speak, perhaps speak with a lower voice, perhaps not as paternalistically as you did. Translate it into to the languages of the people with whom you agree, with whom you speak. And as I suggested, I think this will go nowhere. This presupposes that the end result is the next level, and we know what the next level is. What I suggest is that when we engage with the true Finns in every country, who do exist, the two, you give the name to your true Finns. So when we engage with them, the end result cannot be known in advance. So it cannot be as it has been, for instance, in the 1990s when the liberal lawyers went to Eastern Europe to build up rule of law, checks and balances, and all those institutional solutions dear to the liberals. The end result cannot be seen in advance. It has to be open-ended. Everybody has to change. There's the other serious, I think, proposal also by Philip Alston, a famous human rights lawyer, in a recent article where he suggests that it is the Markovitch curve, it is the elephant curve that is crucial, and that suggests that you should integrate the social dimension in your human rights talk. And Philip Alston, and this is a message he's been giving for a long time, says, well, we should highlight the social, cultural rights covenant. We should integrate social and economic rights in the human rights project more powerfully. Now, I think these social, cultural, and economic rights were always there. As part of the European left, we were always saying economic, social, and cultural when they were saying civil and political. And what I hear when I speak with the true Finns, it is that the language of rights, that the language of rights has failed. It's not whom you are going to privilege with that language, because today, in any case, there isn't a political passion that cannot be articulated in rights speech. Rights speech is transposable to support whatever political agenda, so that rights speech has turned into a bureaucratic balancing of opposing rights claims, precisely what it was once around 1977 when we were called upon to take rights seriously, when that claim was directed against the kind of bureaucratic balancing that rights has now become. Then there's the third alternative. Again, this is something I read on the plane practically. Here, this is Eric Posner from Chicago, a right-wing international lawyer who, with glee, celebrates the final collapse of the liberal center and said, well, what did I tell you? So it's unsustainable, and it's just jargon and ideology and ideas which have now shown themselves as stupid, hopeless, maybe utopian when you say them, but apologetic when you apply them. He didn't use that language. So embrace the true Finns. embrace nationalism, understand that American courts shouldn't ever refer to the courts of other countries, the European Court of Human Rights or the International Court of Justice. Understand that law is an instrument of nationalist struggle. So these are, I suppose, available responses. So what I have to leave you with are just 4 points which are kind of obscure. I'm trying to think about them and probably, hopefully, at some point publish more on them. One is that it's not, you can't survive this with just changing your language. So you can go technical way, you can go principled way, neither one will save you. It has to be something else. Of course, your language will always be either one or the other. They define each other by mutual exclusion. But that will then have to sound somehow different. Second thing, the question of democracy needs to be opened up. One of the great problems in the 1990s liberal hubris was that we thought that democracy meant a very specific set of institutional proposals. Proposals or institutional arrangements that were familiar to us from Western Europe and the United States. There was a certain relationship between courts and political power. There was a certain idea of political democracy and related to voting. There was a certain idea of political accountability, etc. Now, all of these in a larger historical frame are of course very contingent. And the self-determination of a population has been arranged in various different ways. Ideas of republicanism, for example, have in the course of history presented themselves in different ways. So a second point is that these liberal nostrums about the role of the parties, rule of law, checks and balances, and transparency need to be opened up, perhaps rejected, perhaps thought anew. Democracy is a word that has come to mean nothing and everything. Third point, there is no politics outside expertise. Science is politics. So until recently I've met often the argument that, well, the universities are hopeless. And I actually had this conversation after a talk I gave in Princeton last spring, when I sat there with the previous president of the American Political Science Association, Robert Cohen. Many of you know, a famous political scientist and international relations scholar. And he was describing to me the backlash against the universities and the sense he was feeling, and I saw people nodding around the table, that universities in American society are felt to be a bad thing. And why is that? Well, if you ask the true Finns, they would say, well, you know, the people in the universities, they are all green or left and environmentalist, and that they don't represent us. They speak languages that's not familiar to us. And recently I've come to think, yeah, of course that's true. The more you know, the more left environmentalist you become. That's obvious. But it's hard, of course, to say that. But that's something one has to work with. There was a time when the politics of education was important for people who were in the business of the Enlightenment. Now I think the business of Enlightenment is still not over. And I've been recently reading Michael Oakeshott, this hopeless British conservative philosopher who nevertheless has interesting things to say about Enlightenment and education and political positions. So I suggest that there is a left or an international and international lawyers debate open for us to think about education, knowledge, think of it politically, and not to try to suggest that there is some authentic space of politics where inevitably we will win. That doesn't exist. We will win because we know better. And identity politics. So I know in this country this is a controversial thing to say. Stephen Bannon said, as long as they do identity politics, we win. Now that's something that I think critical lawyers have known for the past 20 years. So 1997, 20 years ago, my colleagues at Harvard published this book, so this is Dan Danielson and Karen Engel published this book, After Identity. And when we had those conversations on that work, it was obvious to us that identity will not lead international law and enlightenment anywhere. So we have to look beyond identity. I realized that in situations such as, there's the situation, to address it with no other word, that you have here is really testing ground. And I could have stories, and maybe I'll give some of them in the course of the conversation, if I dare, about identity politics here. The last thing I want to say then, and this is when I think everything is so dark, and that white, male, European, immensely privileged people like me have no role to play in the future society, and shouldn't have any role to play in that society, is that, well, there is something we know. And that something is about history. And if there is, after I've now decided that there are interesting things that happened and continue to happen after the French Revolution, that I think one can end with, is that historical knowledge, historical study of the kind that I've been trying to conduct in the past 10 years or so, is at least helpful in the sense that it opens up these black boxes by showing to us how differently people have been living in similar kinds of conditions at different periods. What that might mean, we could go during the conversation, but I think it's best I end here and invite the other panelists also. Thank you.